is the prophetic portion, by the way. So thank you for being our prophet for this Rosh Hashanah, Adam. We'll be hearing more from Adam later. For now, we hear from me. Shana Tova. As I'm sure you know, Tzedek Chicago has received a great deal of attention, some might call it notoriety, for calling ourselves a non-Zionist congregation. And contrary to what our most cynical critics might say, we didn't choose this label for the publicity. When we founded Tzedek Chicago last year, we used this term deliberately. We did so because we wanted to create an intentional community based on specific core values. Our non-Zionism is not just a label. It comes from our larger conviction to celebrate a Judaism beyond nationalism. This is how we explain this particular core value. You can see it on our website. While we appreciate the important role of the land of Israel in Jewish tradition, liturgy, and identity, we do not celebrate the fusing of Judaism with political nationalism. We are non-Zionist, openly acknowledging that the creation of an ethnic Jewish nation-state in historic Palestine resulted in an injustice against its indigenous people, an injustice that continues to this day. I think it's important that we named this value out loud. We need Jewish congregations that refuse to draw red lines over the issue of Zionism, or at best to simply tolerate non-Zionists or anti-Zionists in their ranks, as long as they stay quiet. We need congregations that openly state that they don't celebrate a Jewish nation built on the backs of another people, that call out, as Jews, a system that privileges Jews over non-Jews. However, I realize that this core value begs another question, and it's one I get asked personally from time to time. It's usually some variant of, saying you're non-Zionist only tells me what you are not. So what is it that your Judaism does celebrate? It's a fair question, and I'd like to address it in my words to you this morning. I want to say at the outset that when I use the term Zionism, I'm referring to political Zionism, the ideology that advocates for a sovereign Jewish state in historic Palestine. I know that historically there have been many different variants of Zionism, but today I really think that issue is largely academic. Political Zionism is the form of Zionism that ultimately succeeded. Political Zionism led to the establishment of the State of Israel, and political Zionism is the ideology that continues to support, justify, and advocate for it. Of course, in today's Jewish community, Zionism is more than just a political ideology. It has become the sine qua non of our Jewish identity. For the Jewish communal establishment, Zionism is the litmus test as to whether one is ultimately inside or outside the Jewish community. This is actually pretty staggering when you consider that Zionism is a relatively recent phenomenon in our centuries-long Jewish history. Before the 1800s, the question, are you or have you ever been a Zionist, was simply not relevant to one's Jewish identity. For centuries, Zion was represented as a mythic spiritual homeland, but for the overwhelming majority of Jews, it was not their actual home. The home in which they lived, the home that provided the essential context for their Jewish lives, was the diaspora. So if I was asked to refer to non-Zionism in positive terms, I would call it diasporism. It feels almost redundant to refer to Judaism in this way, but in the age of Zionism, it's all too easy to forget that Jewish tradition was actually born and bred in the diaspora. Before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, Judaism was land-centered, temple-based. It was a sacrificial system that was already splintering into different competing sects. But after the temple was destroyed, dispersing the Jewish people throughout the diaspora, Pharisaic Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, adapted to this new reality with a religious system that could be observed anywhere in the world. Actually, the Jewish diaspora started to emerge even before this. Centuries earlier, there were thriving Jewish communities in places such as Babylon and Alexandria. But Judaism as we know it came into being after the Romans destroyed the temple and the majority of the Jewish people established communities around the world. Judaism became, as it were, a kind of spiritual roadmap, a spiritually audacious response to the trauma of dispersion and exile. The experience of exile also profoundly affected Jewish tradition itself. A famous midrash teaches, when the people of Israel were exiled, God went into exile with them. I find this theological image of a God in exile exceedingly powerful. Jewish tradition didn't only respond to the physical reality of exile, it viewed exile, or galut, as a spiritual and existential reality. This, I believe, represents the intrinsic beauty and genius of the Jewish conception of peoplehood. We took our own unique experience and universalized it into a spiritual statement about the human condition. Whether we are Jewish or not, we all are, in a sense, wanderers. One way or another, we all know the experience of being strangers in a strange land. And so, from this moment of tragedy and pain, we grew up. We transformed an ancient cultic civilization into a worldwide spiritual peoplehood. We spiritualized the concept of temple and homeland and became a globally based, multinational, multicultural nation that viewed the entire world as its home and sought to perfect it. Our experience of exile became, as it were, a spiritual prism through which we viewed the world and our place in it. It might well be claimed that centuries of Jewish religious creativity resulted from this profound existential mindset. The destruction of the temple birthed another central Jewish ideal, the idea best summed up by the famous line from Zechariah, "Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach," not by might and not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. In a way, when the Jewish people finally fell victim to the mighty Roman Empire, this ironically marked a victory for the central rabbinic precept that there is a power even greater than the mightiest empire. That in the long run, those who put their faith in physical might of powerful empires are, if you will, betting on the wrong horse. The rabbis were painfully aware that the last Jewish attempt at empire was not a happy one. I'm talking about the Hasmonean kingdom that was established in the wake of the Maccabees' victory. The Hasmonean dynasty, a priestly family who had fought against the Hellenized Jews of its day, eventually became fairly Hellenized itself. And when they weren't persecuting the rabbinic Pharisees, our spiritual ancestors, they were busy killing one another and waging ill-advised wars of conquest against surrounding nations. In the end, it didn't take long for the Romans to move in and mop it all up. All in all, the last period of Jewish political sovereignty in the land lasted less than 100 years. It's not a coincidence that the rabbis chose Zechariah and the verse, "not by might and not by power," to be read as the Haftarah portion for the Shabbat of Hanukkah. It's also not a coincidence that the story of the Maccabees was revived and revered by modern Zionists, but I'll get to that a little later. Jewish tradition as we know it could never have existed without the diaspora. Our central Jewish text, the Talmud, was composed and compiled in Babylonia. And the myriad of lands in which we have lived have provided the fertile soil for Jewish spiritual creativity. To be sure, the most important Jewish figures throughout history were very much of their specific cultural time and place. The great 10th century Jewish philosopher Saadia Gaon, the founder of Judeo-Arabic literature, integrated Jewish theology with Hellenistic Greek philosophy of his day. Maimonides' classical philosophical treatises were deeply influenced by the Neo-Aristotelian philosophy of medieval Spain. Franz Rosenzweig's work clearly reflects the ideas of modern German liberalism. I could go on and on talking about music and food and everything Jewish. What we consider to be Jewish is what we consider to be Jewish in our particular cultural time and place. This is not to say that the land ceased to become important in Jewish tradition. The land of Israel remained the Jewish homeland, but now in a spiritual rather than literal sense. Our religious tradition is replete with a powerful yearning for the restoration of Zion, but the rabbis insisted this could only happen with the coming of the Messiah. The midrash I quoted earlier, when Israel went into exile, God went into exile with them, ends with, when they return from exile, God will return with them. In the meantime, the rabbis cautioned, we cannot and must not force God's hand by establishing a sovereign Jewish state by ourselves. This spiritual yearning for Zion is so intrinsic to the Jewish tradition, and this idealized vision of a messianic future of redemption set against the hard realities of the present is as well. Even if we don't literally believe in the coming of a Messiah or reject wholeheartedly the idea of actually rebuilding the temple, I would suggest that this idea has a universal relevance. The dream of a messianic future speaks powerfully to our yearning, our desire for redemption in our lives and the world. We don't have to be traditional messianists to understand that the world we seek has yet to arrive, that our lives and our world are still broken and in need of repair, and that we ourselves have a sacred responsibility to work to bring redemption into the world where we live. I'd like to share another midrash with you now. It's also pretty famous, and I think for good reason. Rabbi visited by the prophet Elijah. Has that ever happened to you, by the way? When will the Messiah come? Asked Joshua. Ask him, replied the prophet. The Messiah is at the gates of Rome, sitting among the poor, the sick, and the wretched. Like him, he changes the binding of his wounds, but does so one wound at a time so that he will be ready to return at a moment's notice. Joshua went to Rome to meet the Messiah. He greeted him, saying, "Peace upon you, master and teacher." The Messiah replied, "Peace upon you, son of Levi." Joshua asked him, "When will you be coming?" And the Messiah responded, "Today." Joshua went back to Elijah, who asked him what the Messiah had said. Joshua told him, adding that the Messiah had not told him the truth. He had promised to come today, but he had not. Elijah explained, "This is what he said to you. Today, if you truly listen to his voice." And that last verse is a quote from Psalm 95. There's just so much power in this midrash, particularly, I think, in the image of the Messiah binding his wounds among the poor and the wretched at the gates of Rome. But it's the final line that drives this point home. The Messiah can come today, but only if we listen to the Messiah's voice. We cannot sit passively by and wait for the world to be redeemed. We can do it ourselves, not by creating a state by ourselves, but by actively modeling the world we seek. But paying attention to the poor, by paying attention to the poor and the wretched at the city gate, by working for a world in which such misery is no more. As I understand it, the sacred core of the Messianic ideal is not the notion of Jewish sovereign independence in their ancient homeland. It is the vision of universal redemption, of justice and peace for all, when, as we read in Micah, all will sit beneath their vine and fig tree and none will make them afraid. Or when, as the book of Isaiah says, the wolf will lay down with the lamb and the leopard will lay down with the kid. Having said this, I admit that messianism can be a messy and dangerous business. There have been many false messiahs throughout Jewish history, and their stories have invariably ended in tragedy, not only Jewish history as we know. Jewishly speaking, one of the most famous false messiah was Shabtai Tzvi, who gained a tremendous Jewish following in the 17th century. His claim to be the chosen one that would lead the Jews back to their sovereign homeland caused so much upheaval that he was forced on pain of death to convert to Islam by the Sultan. His apostasy caused massive disillusionment and schisms throughout the Jewish world. Shabtai Tzvi was very much a product of his time. He arose during a period in the 1600s when a Puritan form of millenarianism was sweeping Europe. Coming primarily out of England, this ideology, this Christian ideology, preached that the Jewish people would literally return to establish a sovereign state in their biblical homeland, an event that would bring about the second coming of Christ. If this ideology sounds familiar to you, this is the very same millenarianism that is espoused by American Christian Zionists today. It was indeed brought to our shores by Puritan colonists. When Jewish Zionism arose, it was founded in the 19th century, and this messianism became fused to a political movement. The possibility of an actual Jewish state in historic Palestine then became very real. The British Lord Arthur Balfour, who wrote the famous Balfour Declaration in 1917, was actually a millenarian Christian himself. His pledge of the British Empire's support to the Zionist movement is the perfect embodiment of this merging of messianism, imperialism, and Jewish political nationalism. I would suggest that Zionism, in its way, is a kind of political false messiah. Theodor Herzl founded the Zionist movement as an explicit rejection of the diaspora and a desire to solve the Jewish question once and for all. Once a Jewish state was established, he believed, Jewish life would be normalized. The overwhelming majority of Jews in the world would immigrate to Israel, and the few remaining would assimilate into their nations, and anti-Semitism would cease once and for all. It's a messianic vision. In the end, though, Zionism embodies, I believe, the most particularist and exceptionalist aspects of Jewish messianism, the establishment of a Jewish independent sovereign state, rather than its vision of the messianic vision of a universal redemption of all peoples. It rejects the idea that we must work to bring about this ideal world, even if we know it may not arrive in our own lifetime. According to political Zionism, we must take it upon ourselves to actively bring about that day through the establishment of a Jewish ethnic nation state with the support of Western imperial powers. This Faustian bargain with empire is also an explicit betrayal of the Rabbi's central dictum, not by might and not by power. This is not to say that the Jewish people have not suffered, often terribly, at the hands of various empires throughout its history. But in the end, those empires have come and gone while we have survived. We ourselves are not the descendants of the Maccabees who founded the last Jewish sovereign commonwealth. They're gone. Our ancestors are the ones who survived because their Judaism was not dependent on physical might and militarism, but rather on Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, learning, worship, and acts of righteousness. Tragically, Zionism, which purported to end the Jewish exile, did so by exiling another people. The State of Israel was created through the expulsion of the Palestinians, who live today under military occupation as second-class citizens in their own land, or else in a diaspora of their own, as refugees or citizens of other countries who are forbidden to return to their homes. I would suggest that even with Jewish political independence in our ancient homeland, the Jews who reside there are in exile. They live in a state that has become the most militarized state in the world, a garrison state that is becoming increasingly isolated from the international community. In the absence of some kind of political revolution, Jews will soon become a minority in their own country. Not an oppressed minority like the Jewish communities of old, but rather an oppressor minority like the apartheid regime in South Africa. Right now, the Jewish population of the world is split almost in half between Israel and the diaspora. Where does this leave those of us in the diaspora who choose not to center our Judaism around Zionism, who refuse to celebrate a Judaism of isolation from the rest of the world? Is there a place for those who want to celebrate the diaspora as a dynamic and fertile ground for a new kind of Judaism? One that embraces our existence among the diverse nations, one that advocates for the universal redemption of all peoples? In fact, that Judaism is already emerging. I do believe we are witnessing the nascent stirrings of the diasporism to which I referred earlier. Jewish feminist scholar Melanie K. Kantrowitz is one of the pioneers who is doing important work in this area. I highly recommend to you her book, The Color of Jews, Racial Politics and Radical Diasporism, in which she lays out this vision as well as the challenges that lay before us, and I'm quoting from her now. Celebrating dispersion, diasporism challenges the Edenic premise, once we were gathered in our own land, now we are in exile. What if we conceive of the diaspora as the center, an oxymoron, putting the margin at the center of the circle that includes, but that does not privilege, Israelis? From margin to center echoes a book title by the African-American feminist Bell Hooks. But Hooks' constituency, women and people of color, comprises the majority of the world's people, suggesting an inevitable natural centrality. The majority belongs at the center. Jews worldwide number only about 13.3 million, a tiny minority except in Israel. Diasporism means embracing this minority status, leaving us with some tough questions. Does minority inevitably mean feeble? Can we embrace diaspora without accepting oppression? Do we choose to be marginal? Do we choose to transform the meaning and enter the margins? Is this possible? End quote. There are increasing numbers of diaspora Jews who are actively grappling with these questions. As I mentioned at the beginning of our service, many of these communities are starting to emerge and will be live streaming their high holidays as well through JVP. Just as there is a new and growing understanding of the concept of diaspora by other peoples, there is also a new exploration of a 21st century form of Jewish diasporism. So what does that mean? What might it look like in practice? I'd like to conclude with a few suggestions. 1, Jews in the diaspora will always be on the margins, but we must reject the notion that marginality must automatically equal vulnerability. Anti-Semitism is a reality in our world, and it will always be so. We are blessed that there is no longer any government state-sponsored oppression against Jewish communities anywhere in the world. Nevertheless, given our past history in the diaspora, we must be forever vigilant against the rise of institutional anti-Semitism anywhere in the world. 2, there are many minorities throughout the world who are being oppressed by their governments at this very moment, including Palestinians. As a minority with a history of oppression ourselves, it is our obligation to stand in solidarity with them. Next, there is a small but enormously courageous community of Israelis who stand in solidarity with Palestinians and are looking to empower diaspora Jewry to stand with them. I met many of them this past summer on a delegation sponsored by the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and 2 other Tzedek members who are in this room accompanied me, Scout Bratt and Leslie Williams. Together with 40 other diaspora Jews and about 20 Israelis, we joined to participate in solidarity actions that were led by Palestinians in Hebron and the South Hebron Hills. There is a significant and growing movement of diaspora and Israeli Jews who are putting themselves on the line to stand with Palestinians in their struggle. We would do well to become a part of it. Next, we must seriously unpack Kantrowitz's question, can we choose to be marginal? It is not as simple as it might seem. There are Jews of color throughout the world, and their numbers are increasing here in this country. However white American Jews might choose to be marginal, they will still be racialized as part of the white majority and enjoy the privilege that comes with it. A Jew of color does not have that choice. Next, if Judaism is a transnational, multicultural peoplehood, we must challenge the assumptions that we carry from our own particular Jewish culture and heritage. Ashkenazic Jews cannot project their experience onto other Jewish cultures. Moroccan Jewish music is just as Jewish as klezmer, even if it might not seem so to Ashkenazic ears. Throughout there is an assumption of Ashkenazic normativity, a kind of Jewish white supremacy. We must not succumb to it. And finally, because of our diverse, multiracial nature, Jews must necessarily embrace anti-racism as a sacred value. The Jewish diaspora is a microcosm of the world we seek to create. If the term Ahavat Yisrael literally means love of your fellow Jew, I must also affirm that love crosses all lines and borders and boundaries. So there you have it, my long answer to that original question. I'm excited by the prospect of exploring what it would mean for Tzedek, not simply to be a non-Zionist community, but to be an active diasporist community, a community that views the world as our true homeland and brings, as Kantrowitz would say, the margins to the center. I'll end with her words. I think they might well make a wonderful mission statement for our community. Diasporism cherishes love across the borders, and let's face it, every reaching out beyond one's own body is a border crossing. If we can stick up for each other across borders and race, we have defeated racism's most powerful weapon. Thus, diasporism embraces intermarriage, embraces mixed race, mixed culture babies. Diasporism is anti-assimilation, not anti-change. We want to raise truly bi- and multicultural children, knowledgeable and proud and connected. Our vehicle is not the bloodline, but culture, history, memory. Diasporists recognize our identity as simultaneously rock, forged under centuries of pressure and water. Rock, forged under centuries of pressure and water, infinitely flexible. Diasporism requires those who know and value past and existing tradition and those who create new ones. This Rosh Hashanah, this new year, let's find new borders to cross together. Shana Tova. I'd like to invite Susan Salador up for a brand new world debut song. You are the